What comes to mind when you look at this man? Paradoxical, isn't it? In this video, he's 67 years old. Doesn't he look pretty good for his age? Overall, he seems like a rather pleasant man. But what if I tell you that this man is a serial killer? Officially, he's been linked to 71 victims. It's a bit shocking, isn't it? And what if I tell you more, that he's currently free, not hiding from anyone, and even a video blogger? In the modern world, that seems unbelievable, doesn't it? So, who is he, and how is this possible? The main character of this story, Pedro Rodriguez Filho, was born on October 29, 1954. Strangely enough, even before birth, he learned what cruelty was. While still in the womb, the child suffered trauma because his father frequently abused his mother. As a result, Pedro was born with a slight skull deformity. He had a total of 12 siblings, and his family lived in Santa Rita do Sapucaí, a municipal district with a population of around 40,000 people. Brazil has always been a country with one of the highest crime rates. This characteristic didn't spare Pedro's hometown. People often say about Brazil that they are sure God exists because looking at what happens on the streets, people know for sure that the devil exists. For this reason, from a young age, every boy in Brazil must know how to defend himself. His grandfather played an important role in raising the boy. Unlike his alcoholic father, he taught Pedro life principles and instilled a strong work ethic from a young age. He took Pedro to the sugarcane fields and to a farm where they slaughtered livestock. Thus, it's easy to understand that violence surrounded the boy from his childhood. It was at home, on the streets, and even on the farm where they butchered animals. Perhaps this became the reason that at an early age in the boy's life, the first brutal crime occurred. When Pedro was 13, without asking his cousin, he took his horse. The cousin was a year older than the boy. He found Pedro and hit him several times. It was then that Pedro first had thoughts of murder. He couldn't even contain them and openly told his cousin that he would kill him. The cousin just laughed and hit the boy again. A couple of days later, Pedro and his cousin were helping their grandfather at the sugar processing plant. That day, Pedro first put his threats into action. They were feeding the cane into the machine for processing. The machine consisted of two rollers that, when rotating, squeezed the juice out of the cane. At some point, Pedro grabbed his cousin's hand with all his strength and pushed it between the rollers. The boy was pulled into the machine up to his shoulder. He probably would have died if the grandfather hadn't turned off the machine in time. That day, Pedro spent the night in jail, but not longer. No one filed a complaint, and the only witness, the grandfather, said it was an accident. Thus, the boy got away with it. His punishment was only that he had to clean the machine from his cousin's blood. Anyway, this was the first red flag for those around him, indicating that despite his young age, it's better not to mess with Pedro. The boy felt no guilt about what happened. On the contrary, he happily talked about correcting the injustice. However, an even more wild story unfolded later. Around a year later, when Pedro was 14, his father, who was working as a school security guard at the time, was fired. The reason was that one of the two guards was stealing food from the school. Of course, they both denied guilt. But the school director believed the second person more and fired Pedro's father. The stigma of being a thief deprived him of the opportunity to find a new job, and the only money the family had was earned by Pedro's mother, Manuela, working as a cleaner. To help the family survive, Pedro started going into the jungle with his grandfather's rifle. There, he hunted animals, mostly monkeys. The boy was sure that his father was unfairly fired, and once again, the sense of revenge overshadowed his reason. A couple of weeks after his father's dismissal, one evening Pedro ambushed the school director and shot him outside his house. Then he went to school and waited for the security guard there, whom the guy believed had set up his father. He pointed a gun at him and said, "Now, because of your lies, my family is starving. Do you think that's fair?" The man started crying and begged to spare his life, but the guy didn't listen and fired 2 bullets into the security guard's body. He covered the dead body with cardboard, set it on fire, and then fled. Of course, now there was no avoiding prison, and returning home was impossible. The guy escaped to Sao Paulo to his godmother. There, he began infiltrating the local criminal world. He quickly joined one of the local small gangs involved in drug trafficking. The gang was led by a young woman who was the widow of the former gang leader. She was quite attractive and successfully used it, manipulating men. Pedrinho also fell under her influence. For several years, he served her, and, as he himself says, they were in love with each other. It's hard to assert this about the girl, but he apparently was. During this time, in various criminal disputes, he committed several murders. Then, when Pedrinho had been in the gang for several years, a rival group set up an ambush. In the shootout, most members of Pedrinho's gang, including the girl he was in love with, were killed. The guy himself was injured, but he managed to escape. He took refuge with his uncle, who introduced him to a community of fanatics. They practiced sacrificing animals, and their beliefs were somewhat similar to voodoo. The guy spent about a year inside this sect. There, he underwent a certain ritual of rebirth and received a rather simple necklace. It became his talisman, which, as he himself said, now protected him from enemy bullets and completely rid him of fear. After the so-called rebirth, the guy changed his approach to choosing victims. He couldn't get rid of the urge to kill, but now he decided to kill only, as he said, bad people. He saw himself as a protector of the weak. He killed pedophiles and those who treated women cruelly. Over time, he moved to Rio de Janeiro. There he met a girl named Maria Aparecida. The girl soon became pregnant, and the couple moved to a modest shack. It's easy to guess that Pedrinho had many enemies, which led to a very expected ending. One day, returning home, he found Maria, who was already 6 months pregnant, dead, and on the wall, written in her blood, was "We will get to you too." As already mentioned, the guy had so many enemies that it was difficult to understand who did it. He spent more than a year searching for the culprits, interrogating and killing various informants. Then a woman contacted him, who turned out to be the former wife of a drug dealer named China. The man Pedrinho stole goods from a couple of years ago. The woman explained that it was China and his gang who killed Pedrinho's girl. The guy was disappointed that he hadn't thought of it himself. He learned that in a couple of weeks, China's brother was getting married. Then he hired 2 more people, and on the day of the wedding, they burst into the hall with weapons. It was unexpected for everyone. During the shootout, 7 men were killed, including the leaders China, and 15 more people were injured. By the way, among the killed and wounded, there was only one woman, China's mother, who was injured trying to protect her son. This was Pedrinho's revenge for the murdered girl and the unborn son. Such a bold reprisal added a lot of authority to the guy in the criminal world. After this, he got his famous nickname Matador. He began to instill fear in many. Around the same time, he made his most famous tattoo, the inscription Mata por prazer, which translates as kills for pleasure. During the next period, the guy committed several more murders. According to him, it was as if the devil possessed him. At that moment, Pedrinho uttered the words, "This body is yours, this blood is yours." In the end, he continued to kill various criminals on the streets because he simply couldn't stop. This continued until May 24, 1973. On that day, the police received information that Matador, as he was now called, was in one of the bars. During the raid, the guy was wounded and woke up handcuffed to a hospital bed. He spent 25 days in the hospital under round-the-clock guard. After he was able to move independently, the guy finally appeared in court. Despite claiming to have killed at least 100 people, he was charged with only 14 murders. In the end, he was sentenced to 130 years in prison and was sent to serve his sentence at the Araraquara prison in Sao Paulo. As a brief digression, it's worth mentioning that in Brazil, as in Latin America in general, prison conditions, to put it mildly, leave much to be desired. Cells are often overcrowded, leading many inmates to sleep on the floor. Prisons are rife with various diseases such as tuberculosis, HIV, and the like. Rarely does anyone survive in a Brazilian prison for more than 15 years. However, for Pedrinho, the main danger was not diseases, but rather friends and relatives of those he had killed before entering prison. After the trial, Matador was placed in a prisoner transport vehicle. In the same compartment with him, alone, also serving his sentence, was a serial rapist. When the convoy arrived at the prison, upon opening the door of the vehicle, inside sat Pedrinho Matador, and his fellow traveler was already dead. It's hard to say how he managed it, but he strangled his companion even while in handcuffs. As mentioned, the guy had many enemies in prison from the beginning. They were friends and acquaintances of his victims. The prison guards, for the most part, didn't care about local disputes. Fortunately for the guy, he quickly managed to get a knife. In one of Matador's first days in prison, 5 people surrounded him in the yard. Their intention was clear. Details are not discussed about how it happened, but soon 3 out of the 5 were killed, and 2 were fatally wounded. Matador also got wounded in this brawl, but not as fatally as his opponents. Thus, from the very first days, without joining any of the gangs, Pedro Matador confirmed the reputation of a person better not to mess with. His mother and grandmother occasionally visited him, no one else. It seemed like what else interesting could happen in his life when he was already behind bars? Well, he was only 20 years old at the time, and it was just the beginning of his legendary story. One day, when Matador had been in prison for about 3 years, guards approached him and said that the prison director wanted to see him. The guy went with them. On that day, another shock awaited him. The director informed him that Pedrinho's mother had been hacked to death with a machete at night. Of course, one might read that someone from his numerous enemies could have done it, but no, it was his own father. That night, he was drunk and in a fit of jealousy hacked his sleeping wife. Surely, there are very few things in the world that can bring tears to such a cruel person. But the death of his mother is exactly what made Pedrinho cry. Of course, Matador was overwhelmed with a sense of revenge, but how could he get to his father from prison? Well, he was incredibly lucky because his father ended up in the same prison where Matador was. However, they were in different wings, but that was no obstacle for Pedrinho. It wasn't difficult for him to get into the wing where his father was. He entered his father's cell. The cellmates of the guy's father understood everything and simply silently left the cell. The father also understood everything. According to Matador's words, the father said to him, "Son, are you entitled to do this?" A fight began, during which Matador dealt 22 knife blows to his father, one more than the latter had inflicted on the guy's mother. After that, he left the cell and voluntarily surrendered to the guards. Matador understood that he would spend the rest of his life in prison. So why limit his need for killing? He continued to kill people he considered unworthy to live: rapists, pedophiles, murderers of children and women. Soon, he got another nickname, the Punisher. Mostly, he kept to himself, but sometimes he had friends. One of them was a guy named Claudio. Claudio had a short prison sentence, and before his release, Matador gave him the address of the guy's grandmother, saying that people there would help him get back on his feet after leaving prison. After his release, Claudio indeed went to Pedrinho's grandmother. There, he started a relationship with one of Matador's sisters, Silvana. However, one day, in a fit of jealousy, he killed the girl. Of course, because of this crime, Claudio returned to prison. Matador said he held no grudge against him, but a couple of days later, Pedrinho beheaded the guy, saying that now Silvana had been avenged. In prison, Pedrinho learned to read and write. Thanks to the press, he gained popularity. He received dozens of letters daily, including from girls. He ignored most of them, but one interested him, from a girl named Anna. She was also an inmate. They began to correspond and eventually met after the girl was released. The man became the subject of interest for many prison psychiatrists. They unanimously agreed that Pedrinho is incapable of feeling empathy or remorse, suffering from paranoia and a personality disorder. His main life motivation was self-assertion through violence. Despite the fact that, unlike most psychopathic criminals, he chose equals and didn't harm women and children, it didn't negate the fact that he was a serial killer. This fact was indisputable, even considering that his victims were only criminals. Like almost all serial killers, Matador collected clippings from the newspaper Sebe about his crimes. In 1985, the 14 murders for which Matador was imprisoned were officially supplemented by another 57, committed in 9 prisons where he was held. His sentence was changed from 130 years to 400, and in 1985, he was placed in a prison psychiatric ward. The conditions here were much stricter. Each inmate was in a separate cell. Engaging in sports or taking short walks was allowed only under the watchful eye of the guards, depriving Matador of the opportunity to kill. He started reading and writing more and also played cards. The only outlet for his rage was a sandbag, serving as a punching bag. According to Pedrinho, some of his victims came to him in dreams in the form of various animals. In particular, his father was always in the form of a snake. Matador spent 5 years in the prison psychiatric ward, and only after that, in 1990, he returned to the general prison. However, clashes with other inmates continued, leading him back to solitary confinement. In 1998, another well-known Brazilian serial killer, Francisco de Assis Pereira, arrived at the prison where Pedrinho was at that time. A man who had raped and killed at least 11 women. Journalists often visited Matador in prison. One of them asked what Matador thought about Francisco Pereira. The man replied, "Today my dream is to be alone with him. I hate rapists, those who take the lives of the weak. If I have even the slightest chance, I will kill him." The prison director learned about these words and did everything to ensure that these two never crossed paths. Pedrinho continued to be in solitary confinement. Both he and Francisco Pereira always walked under guard surveillance, so Matador never realized his dream. In early 2003, the Brazilian justice system faced a rather unusual problem. The Criminal Code of Brazil was written at a time when the average life expectancy in Brazil was 43 years. For this reason, the code stated that a person could not spend more than 30 years in prison. The paradoxical case was that a person officially convicted of 71 murders, although he claimed there were more than 100, having spent 30 years in prison, gained the right to release. Of course, the authorities could not allow this and continued to look for legal loopholes to keep Matador behind bars. However, as a result of numerous appeals, Pedrinho Filho was finally released on April 24, 2007. He spent 34 years in prison, 4 years more than the current legislation allowed. After his release, Pedrinho moved to a small house in a village near Sao Paulo. There, he got a Labrador and started working on a local farm. Initially, neighbors were wary of him, but later, they told journalists that he was a good, hard-working guy. But was it right to leave such a person free? In 2011, the police tracked down Pedrinho again. He was accused of disorderly conduct and unlawful restraint. He committed these crimes while still in prison. At the time of his arrest, he had a revolver, but he did not resist arrest. How does this correlate with the fact that, according to the law, a person cannot spend more than 30 years in prison? Presumably, this refers to the period from 2004 to 2007. This was beyond those 30 years that Matador had to serve. But at that time, he was still in prison. Perhaps the explanation lies in the fact that if a person commits a crime after those 30 years he served in prison, this rule is as if reset, and now he can be imprisoned for up to 30 years again. Pedrinho returned to prison, but now he was incredibly popular. Reporters and those eager to make a film about him visited him almost every week. Many consider him the prototype of the character Dexter from the TV series, a guy with an insatiable thirst for killing but who only kills criminals. Matador himself said, "I didn't kill anyone who didn't deserve to die." Pedophiles. Rapists. Should they live? After 6 years, in 2017, Pedrinho was released for the second time. At that time, he was 63 years old and looked quite good for his age. He returned to life in a small village and also restored relations with one of his sisters. After his release, a wave of popularity engulfed him. He often appeared on various popular YouTube channels where he was interviewed about his life. Moreover, with the help of one of his friends, he started shooting some videos about his life after release. At the moment, he continues to live an ordinary life, a life he now shares with many on the internet. He is very popular in Brazil, where, according to statistics, only 10% of murders are solved. According to society, he, Matador, was the real justice in the country. It's a quite controversial point of view, but it has its place.